All right. I couldn't figure out which, that's very dark.
It is, okay, all right, let's go back.
Don't you think so? Here, this is the,
Yep, there you go. All right.
oh, you can
Is
see.
that better?
You can see
You
each
all
other,
see that?
right?
Yeah, we
Yeah,
still
we
are.
are.
All right, all right.
I couldn't see you, Frank.
Thank you.
How many were not from Baltimore? Okay. I mean, like, nah, you're Baltimore. Yeah. I'm gonna count you, Michelle. Well, I'm originally from Philadelphia, then I wouldn't even count myself. Okay, so most of you have been around this area. I thought there were a couple of you that were gonna be from out of town. So I'm gonna kind of go across very quickly some key points in the data. Like Frank mentioned, this is a project now that is 20 years old. I have only been there for the past 10 of those 20. So resting on the shoulders of lots of great people that even started it to begin with. And you can imagine, we put out over 100 indicators, now into its 20th year, over 100, over 55 communities that we put out the data for. So it's a huge data box, and then we continuously add to that. And so the question is, what have we gleaned from looking at this kind of data over time? So,
Down.
Got it, all right. 100 indicators, all good stuff. You guys can dig in as much as you want, but I will tell you there is one main indicator. Are we growing or are we declining? And I'm going to keep coming back to this moment because look, Baltimore City was a city built out by 1950 for 950,000 people. And so we have the infrastructure for 950,000 people, and today we are roughly 600, maybe 605,000. Think about the per capita burden on infrastructure when you're basically dealing with way more stuff than you need. And that's where we are as a city. So we think about urban America. This is not unique, right? Lots of cities have lost population, but what's going on in Baltimore is what I'm obviously going to focus on. And the point is that this kind of population loss is the result of many different things over the course of the last 60 years. There's no one answer to what has been happening to the city of Baltimore, and thinking about the layering effect of all of these things is kind of where we are today, right? It's the legacy of all these things from the last 60 years. So let's remind ourselves what's been going on for the last 60 years. Depopulation in urban America started in the 50s, largely as the result of school desegregation. And in many cases, Baltimore City is almost a poster child of not wanting to integrate. There's lots of books and research on the fact that we did everything in our power to prevent ourselves from actually integrating as a city. And then, if you are, as a city, kind of forced to attempt to try and desegregate, the result has been suburbanization, obviously fueled at the same time by the interstate highway system that was under construction at the same time. And then that kind of fueling of people being able to leave was obviously racially defined. White folks were allowed to get mortgages, white folks were in areas where they could even sell their properties, and then you have all kinds of unfair housing practices like steering, blockbusting, and of course redlining that had begun in the 1930s. So all of this confluence is happening starting in the 1950s, that pushing white people out, keeping African Americans in, and what we get in the 1960s is civil and racial unrest. That obviously fuels even more people fleeing the city of Baltimore, but that's not what's necessarily happening today. We have the results of that of those processes, but that's not what's going on today. The 1970s is globalization, right? So jobs are not just leaving the city of Baltimore, jobs are leaving the country. And the city of Baltimore having to kind of reorganize itself into a post-manufacturing city. Again, not unique to the city of Baltimore. This is going on in every city, especially in the Rust Belt and here on the East Coast. The 1980s is a pretty good book by William Julius Wilson called The Truly Disadvantaged. If you haven't read that one, really talking about the ramifications of that severe loss of jobs and the impact that it had on all of our cities and the resulting war on drugs that certainly didn't help that devastation. And then the 90s is the hangover of all of these things happening. The 90s is when the Baltimore city lost the most population. We lost 90,000 people in that one decade. For any of you that was in Baltimore at the time. That was kind of the apex of the decline. So we think about post-2000 as potentially the turnaround decade, right? If you were here, we saw lots of activity. We saw increases in home pricing. We saw the downtown being kind of resurrected. Lots of Class B and C commercial buildings turning into residential, and so now we even have a population downtown, which didn't exist before. And then we saw the result being 35% of our neighborhoods did in fact grow between 2000 and 2010. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough of a turnaround. This is the most important thing that you take away from today. We are sitting as the only East Coast city to continue to lose population. We are sitting in the megalopolis region of the United States between Washington, D.C. and Boston, and we are the only city to continue losing population. Newark, New Jersey gained population. Right? I'm from Philly. How can Newark, New Jersey gain population? You know, Philly gained population even in that sense. And these are cities where we saw the same story, right? New York was going into bankruptcy in the 1970s. Washington, D.C. used to be the crime capital of the world, or the United States. And they have all managed to turn around. So do not think that this cannot happen for Baltimore. The stories that you're going to hear in the media, we can overcome this, and in many cases, we must overcome this, because what are we sitting in if we're losing 5 to 10% of our population? We are deoxygenating. I don't care what issue you care about, if you care about economic development or public health or crime or whatever, we're sitting in a context where we're deoxygenating. Nothing will ensue if we don't actually address this. And the things that we might take on should enable this. How can we repopulate the city of Baltimore? Because if we don't do that, we're just going to continue to deoxygenate. So this idea of deoxygenating, I'm going to keep coming back to, and how do we kind of get out of that? So all of this kind of population decline didn't happen uniformly. Like I mentioned, some people were able to get out. Many people were kind of stuck in place. There's actually a good book by Patrick Sharkey called Stuck in Place, about urban neighborhoods that kind of keep people confined in their places. And so this is also something you're going to hear about in Baltimore, which you might already have, about the notion of the black butterfly and the white owl. So we have essentially segregated ourselves. This is kind of where we have high concentrations of African American, which looks like a little bit of a butterfly wing, and this is where we have high concentrations of white, which kind of goes right down the center and kind of around the water to make the white owl. But I didn't get a chance to show the map because I couldn't find it this morning. But the city of Baltimore's level of segregation is sitting in an entire metropolitan region of segregation. The entire Baltimore metropolitan region is highly segregated, which is very unusual, again, in this kind of megalopolis region of the East Coast. If I were to show you a map of the entire region, what you would see is that black butterfly kind of goes into the county, Baltimore County, goes onto the east side, in Dundalk, Essex area, goes on the west into Reisterstown and Security area, right? And does not grow much beyond that. The high concentrations of African Americans are still in that kind of broader butterfly wing. If you looked at Hispanic population in the metropolitan region, stunningly, all up and down the I-95 and 895 border, literally. If you go all the way up into Aberdeen, go down into Maryland City, and what does that mean for the city of Baltimore? The parts of the city that connect to 895 and 95 have high rates of Hispanic, which is East Baltimore and South Baltimore. And then if you look at the Asian population, pretty much in Howard County. And then white is everywhere else. And it's stunning. We actually did a project, which again, I can send you the map, that there are very, very, very few places in the entire metropolitan region that are truly integrated. So the fact that Baltimore is a poster child for not wanting to integrate, Baltimore City is just at the center of that. The entire metropolitan region has a problem with respect to actual integration. So what are the consequences of this kind of separation and this kind of divide? There's great new work by Paul Jaworski from Rutgers University. We know about income inequality changing in the last 40 years. He's done this for every single metropolitan region in the United States, so I welcome you to look at where, other parts of the city, other parts of the country. And since the 1970s, in the Baltimore metropolitan region, income inequality has grown by 13%. So the bottom 25% and the top 5%, that gap has grown by 13%. If we just looked at household income, is that there is a sorting that happens by income, which now impacts the ability to see neighborhood differences. So even though household income has, kind of the gap has grown by 13%, spatial gap by neighborhood has increased by 25%. So the bottom 25 neighborhoods with respect to poverty and the top 25% with respect to wealth, that gap has grown by 25%. So there's an increasing spatial gap. And so what does that mean on the ground? So we know that there's racial gap. We know that. So if you just looked at life expectancy in the city of Baltimore in 2016, for white population at 76.6 years, for black population at 71.6 years. So there's a 5-year gap. We have to overcome that. The question is how and why is this gap occurring? There's obviously some, clearly racial tension on kind of a personal level and a systemic level, but also on a spatial level. So we have 2 neighborhoods that are both 93% African American, and there is a 10-year life expectancy gap between those 2 neighborhoods. Howard Park is on the west side, where the ShopRite is up on Liberty Avenue. They have a life expectancy of 76 years, which was the same average for white Baltimoreans. And on the east side, Clifton Berea has a life expectancy of 66 years. And that also happens in white neighborhoods, right? We have 2 neighborhoods that are 65% white in the city of Baltimore, and there's a 10-year age gap, life expectancy gap in those 2 neighborhoods too. So Morrill Park down in the southwest has a life expectancy, is that 73 years? And then North Baltimore, Guilford has a life expectancy of 83 years. So we have a racial gap of 5 years, but we actually have an even broader spatial gap of 10 years. And again, thinking about how our work can impact these areas. So what's the impact of neighborhoods of this racial inequality as well as spatial inequality? I want to first make sure we all understand what a neighborhood even is. Let's really think about what the bundle of goods your neighborhood provides you. It is far more than where you hang your hat, right? It is that, but it determines who your neighbors are. It determines, in many cases, how you are organized, if your neighborhood even is organized. And the organization of neighborhoods in a city like ours is critical to remain resilient across all kinds of things that might happen, both locally and federally and internationally in some cases. We know that, it determines your services. Your address is the basis of like everything, right? And your address is the basis of where your kids might go to school. Your address is who represents you at all levels of government. Your address determines so many of your services that if you are in a particular place, that is given to you, right? You have some agency, but you have the collective agency to change things. In a city like ours, it very much has to do with identity. It means something to live in Pigtown. It means something to live in Lauraville. There's a history associated with that. There's a community associated with that. There's a well-being associated with having kind of that connection to your past. And like I just showed, we now know that your zip code has more to do with your health outcomes than your genetic code, right? I showed you the kind of the gap in the life expectancy in those 2 neighborhoods. What most communities, so I go into communities and provide this data to communities all the time. The thing that most communities don't really think about, and I know you all will, is that your address determines your market, period. Your address determines your housing market, whether or not you can buy or sell your house has far more to do with the location, whether or not you put in the granite countertop, right? And it has to do with all of your retail markets. Right? Retailers are looking at your demographic information before they even jump into a place. And what is retail? Food is retail. The storefront bank is a retail institution, especially more and more so today than in the past. So having the things that people want in a neighborhood is, you have to think like a retailer. And we have to get neighborhoods to think like what retailers are looking for. What kind of square footage supermarket can I possibly put in a place that is declining in population? Right? Is my square footage for 14,000 when I'm in a context where in 10 years it'll actually be 10,000, right? How do I even know? And in the opposite case, when you're growing, if I do something for 14,000 folks, and it grows to 20,000, that benefits me, right? The opposite is a killer for retail. So the things that people care about, food, financial services, other retail, you have to start to make sure that the aggregate demand in the neighborhood is actually there for the retailers to come, right? And this is the kind of work that we do when we go out to neighborhoods to think about that aspect of how they want the retailer. So we did lose population as a city by 4%, but notice, I'm gonna keep coming back to the black butterfly kind of metaphor. Notice where we continue to lose population. Some neighborhoods grew, some neighborhoods did not grow, and this is kind of the tale of two Baltimores, right? You see some neighborhoods with the cranes and everything growing, and you see some neighborhoods that continue to decline. I want to pay particular attention to this west side. The west side of Baltimore has seen a slow decline. We think about East Baltimore, kind of the epicenter of kind of the East Baltimore development area where we literally saw things come down. But the west side is this quiet, kind of slow decline that we have to make sure. And the thing about the way we're organized, these are councilmanning districts. We're not organized to think this way, right? To think about this one fundamental thing. Are you growing or are you declining? Our elected officials hear everything. They hear, you can see most of them are in neighborhoods where some are declining, some are growing, and some are stable. So they hear every issue, and it's hard to kind of organize ourselves as a city to actually address the specific issues of neighborhoods. And so what are the specific neighborhood issues? Well, they come in a set of goods, right? You can imagine your own neighborhood, the kinds of things that your neighborhood might care about. If you're in a growing neighborhood, what do you care about? What are you going to hear about if you're coming in as an entrepreneur, or you're coming in as an elected official? You're going to hear about the fact that you've got congestion, right? You're going to hear about traffic congestion. You're going to hear about rising housing prices, right? Because you've got extra demand for a set of supply, and the supply is not obviously keeping up with the demand. And you're going to hear about fear of displacement. You're going to hear about actually a rise in crime. This rise in population begets retail. Retailers are chasing growth. Retailers are beguiled by growth. And with that retail growth is where we got kind of the crimes of opportunity, right? You can come out of the store, you can get mugged, you can have your car sitting out front, and your car can be, hijacked, can be broken into. Those are the kinds of things, and it's a set of things. They're all interrelated in a place that's growing. All of these things are going to be true. These are real problems. That's not to say that these are not problems, but they're completely different problems from a place that is declining and contracting, right? Like I said, people might be losing population, but the infrastructure doesn't change, right? So what's the number one thing you see when you have a declining population is vacant and abandoned property? That's the number one indicator for population loss. People might leave, people might pass away, nobody picking up that and occupying that housing stock, and so vacant and abandoned property becomes the number one indicator. And I kind of want to remind people of, really think about that. When you see vacant and abandoned property, that's other people that have left it behind, right? The burden is still to the people that are there. They're still there. They didn't leave. They aren't, contributing to vacancy. They're actually contributing to occupancy. And how can we support them in the decisions that other people have made when they leave behind? And in that vacancy is what happens to, illicit behavior. This is where you start to see the violent crime. The violent crime tends to be more based on social networks, right? It's the retribution, the self-justice. It's not the, someone coming out of a store and the crime and opportunity happens. That could be happening too, but the vast majority of what you're going to hear about in these declining neighborhoods is this idea of the self-policing and kind of not wanting to trust the outside because things are contracting. This is where you hear about food deserts. This is where you hear about school closings. Why? Because you're losing population, right? So you're losing kids and you're losing your retail demand. And so the set of things that you're going to hear about in a declining neighborhood are all wrapped up into that one indicator, right? That you're actually contracting and everything that ensues therefore. And remember, this is the burden to fewer and fewer people, right? Again, a deoxygenating situation. So the answer to getting a grocery store in there or getting a bank in there is to make sure that you actually have the sustainable things that want the bank to be there. And the one thing that they're all looking for is population growth. right? You're looking in the Claritas data, you're looking for change in population, pretty simple, but we have to deal with the daily work that it takes to actually repopulate some of these neighborhoods. Let me tell you about the daily work. I'm sure everybody's curious about vacant and abandoned housing. I could probably talk about this for an hour and a half in itself. But let's just say that looking at the data that we have, and not at the phone, looking at the data that we have, we were able to look at some exploratory data, just looking kind of, again, over 20 years, looking at longitudinal data across different neighborhoods. And we were able to see that there is a threshold beyond which a neighborhood will not grow. And you can imagine from a psychological point of view why that might be true. And the threshold is very low. It's 4%. We found that no neighborhood grew between 2000 and 2010 if it crossed over 4% vacant and abandoned housing. And if it was at 4% in 2000, it stayed below 4%. And if it was above 10% vacant and abandoned housing in 2000, it grew exponentially. Why? Because you just became a place where people left and nobody was repopulating. So Sandtown Winchester, which is over here on the west side, was at 19% in 2000, and today it's at 35%. But places like Roland Park and even in this Midtown area, which was actually at around 7%, but came down below 4% in the last 20 years. So this idea of the threshold becomes something incredibly actionable, right? You have a goal now. What can a community do to get down below 4%? And some of our communities have much, much more to go. In Sandtown Winchester, if you wanted to go, it's at 35% vacant and abandoned housing. If you wanted to go below 4%, that's 2,300 properties. Who owns them, right? We're now in the kind of intestate, all the probate issues and liens issues and the mire of all that for anybody that might be involved in the real estate market. That's just one neighborhood with 2,300 kind of cases that we might go through. How can we kind of move through that more quickly? But again, think about, this is the vacant and abandoned housing. This is, unfortunately, the black butterfly, the same pattern of high vacancy rates. And what I want to show is that even though we have 110 indicators, unfortunately, we have some other things that we think are going to help the situation. So this is temporary cash assistance, which we think is going to try and get people out of poverty. But they're living in high vacancy neighborhoods, right? Because they can't afford anything else on temporary cash assistance. So we essentially subsidize people to live in high vacancy neighborhoods. And we think that somehow they're going to get out of the situation, which they're not, right? So this is the temporary cash assistance. Notice the same pattern as vacant and abandoned housing. And I could put anything up here, any measure of distress that you want, and it's unfortunately going to come up with the same pattern. And I want you to also remember that these are coming from totally different agencies. This is data coming from our city housing department, which is code violations, social code violations saying the house is uninhabitable. This is coming from the State Department of Human Resources that issues the temporary cash assistance as a benefit. Two totally different agencies, probably don't talk much to each other, and yet the same outcome. So we do have some pretty key recommendations, again, to kind of get out of that. And these are some of the neighborhoods that Innovation Works is going to be working in. So in our highest vacant and abandoned housing neighborhoods with more than 20%, one of the things that we actually need is a plan on how to get out of that, right? Have a vision of what that could look like below 4%. We all know what Port Covington's gonna look like. Will it actually look like that? I don't know. But we have a vision of what it could look like. We have no vision for what Sandtown Winchester could even look like below 4%. Anybody know the last time Sandtown Winchester had a small area master plan? Anyone want to take a guess? It had an urban renewal plan that was created in 1976, and it was updated in 1993. How do you plan of where you want to go if you don't have a plan of where you want to go? Right? No military action happens without a plan. No business, starts without a plan. And like I said, it's not that the plan is going to come to fruition. It's the act of planning that gets people to even know what direction you're headed in. And that is a critical thing that we need to make sure that all of these neighborhoods have. Certainly a recommendation that was given not only to you, but to everybody down the line, and hopefully we can all together actually make this come true. But I want you to think about what I'm saying, right? You need a plan to know where you're headed, right? Has anybody gone to Sandtown Winchester? What are you going to hear when you go to Sandtown Winchester? You're going to hear about immediate needs, right? I need a job, I need a house, I need health care. No one in that neighborhood is going to come to you and say, hey, I really want to do an area master plan. So it's not to say that their immediate needs aren't valid, they are. But sometimes you actually need to do the other thing too, right? To have this simultaneous income as a recommendation to get that neighborhood going. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor's office, go to the emergency room with a broken arm. I'm not a medical doctor, but I can see about a broken arm, right? I know what's going on. But what are they going to do when I walk in? They're going to still check my temperature, my pulse, and my heart, right? Because if those things aren't operating right, it doesn't matter if they fix my arm. Same idea in our neighborhoods. So the other thing that is kind of an issue as a city, one of the biggest differences, what's the difference between Baltimore, New York, Washington, Boston? We are the only East Coast city without a major transportation system. We're the only one. Newark, New Jersey, I actually went up to Newark maybe 2 months ago, first time in many years. Had to go to NGIT. I don't know if anybody's been to Newark recently. I got off at Penn Station and took a 75-cent light rail ride to NGIT. And it was coming every 5 minutes. This is urban, this is not just urban America, this is urban international, right? You have to be able to move around in dense areas. And until we figure this out, we've got a serious circulation problem. So we're not only deoxygenating, but we are lacking circulation. And so let's take a look at where those neighborhoods were that grew. Everything in the light blue, our neighborhoods that grew between 2000 and 2010, even though we as a city declined, so we certainly have strong neighborhoods. But it's not just the neighborhoods themselves kind of willy-nilly growing. They are literally sitting on a transit system, transportation system, I should say. In the absence of a transit system, right, that we didn't get the red line, we don't really have a regional master plan for transit. In the absence of that, how do we circulate? We circulate on our interstate highway system. And so the interstate highway system is how we move around. And so what is happening? Development happens exactly around our circulatory system. Development is happening around 83. Development is happening on I-95. Development is happening all around 695, which is the county and Anne Arundel County. So if you look at where development patterns are, they are literally tied to the circulatory system because this is what people prefer. And in fact, do I have that as the next slide? Let me show. This is a survey that we did with people that just recently moved out of the city of Baltimore into the county. We think about taxes and schools as being the 1 and 2 reasons that people move out, but it was actually access to a thoroughfare. You can't live in one neighborhood in the city of Baltimore and not be able to access the entire region for something, right? You have to get to the airport at some point. You have to get to the mall in Towson at some point. You have to potentially get to a job. You have to get to like a park. You have to be able to circulate, and many of our neighborhoods are so isolated from that ability to circulate from the physical transportation system that that's a cause of atrophy, right? If your muscles don't have access to circulation, what are they going to do? They're going to atrophy. And this is exactly what is going on, especially on that west side of Baltimore. So this is the indicator that we actually, and we try to use indicators that make sense to people, that you don't have to be a statistician to understand what I'm talking about. So this is the indicator that actually became the most negatively correlated indicator to population loss. It's also the indicator that Raj Chetty and his work up in Harvard actually came to the same conclusion, although I will say that our report came out 1 year before his. Nobody knows my name, but everybody knows Raj Chetty's name. But it's fascinating to think about the fact that the data provides kind of this ability to make these exploratory analyses. But the 45-minute commute time, again, thinking about what this means in your neighborhood, if so many people in your neighborhood, in the middle of a city, which is the urban job core, right? Which is the metropolitan job core for jobs. In the middle of a city, if you're traveling 45 minutes to get to work, what are you not doing? You're not in your neighborhood for at least an hour and a half of the day. You're not able to get to the parent-teacher conference. You're not able to kind of do the community cleanup. You're not able to attend the community meeting at night because you're just traveling so far to get to work. And it's an irony that access to a job should be an urban amenity, right? You move into the city because you're going to reduce your time to travel. That is why people do it, because time is money. And so moving into the city should be that kind of an opportunity. And look at where we have high commute times in West Baltimore. Not in the middle of the city, right? It's in these areas that, Downtown Winchester was our #1 place for high commute time. And today, it's switched. Southern Park Heights is now our #1 high commute time neighborhood. And again, it's a loss of social capital when you have so many people leaving your neighborhood on a daily basis. So this is kind of a circulatory problem, right? These neighborhoods are inaccessible. They're not able, you can't get in, you can't get out. I don't know if anybody travels on the west side of town, but Forest Park is kind of 2 neighborhoods over from, no one's going to Forest Park unless they're going to Forest Park, right? You're not just driving by Forest Park ever. And until we get those kind of eyes into our neighborhoods, they're not even a glint in any kind of retailer's eye or somebody trying to buy a house in that neighborhood, because they don't even see it, right? Out of sight is completely out of mind. And that is what kind of the entire west side of Baltimore, unfortunately, right now represents. Nothing to do with people living there, but it's the nature of how the circulatory system has essentially put a tourniquet around West Baltimore. They don't get oxygen. So the key recommendations around this are obviously a new transit system. I don't see that happening anytime soon. It's actually, I'm not a transit engineer or anything like that, but and I don't know if anybody here is involved in transportation, but I would say transportation is like a radicalizing concept in Baltimore because it makes people so mad. You can't get around. And we should be able to figure this out, right? Every other city on the East Coast has figured this out. I will say, though, that I've started to think about, we cannot be chasing 1980 Philadelphia. Philadelphia completed its metro system in 1985 when Reading Terminal kind of got completed in the middle of the city. So you could go from Newark, Delaware, all the way up to Trenton, New Jersey now. And that happened in 1985. That was 40 years ago. We shouldn't be chasing 1985 Philadelphia or 1912 New York, which is when their system got created. Maybe we need to be looking for the 21st century solution for circulation in the city of Baltimore. Maybe we should be thinking of free Lyft and Uber for anybody who lives in the city of Baltimore. Or maybe we should have a city app specifically for ride sharing. Montgomery County is doing virtual buses where you call the bus when you need it, and there's a designated stop, so it's not to your door, but it's at least to a stop. This is the kind of thinking that we need to have in our city desperately, because we need to be able to get around, and we need to actually incentivize people to come in to get around. Because like I mentioned, people are literally moving out because they want access to the highway. That's sad. We can fix that, right, in a city like ours. I also want to think about for workforce training, and one of the things that I think this is innovative about Innovation Works is that one of the things, why you're traveling so far to get to work, it's just there's no jobs in your neighborhood, right? So how can we bring jobs to the neighborhood? That's a critical thing, whether you're in workforce training, whether you're in entrepreneurship generation, thinking about how we can do that in our neighborhoods. And then the last thing, I don't know how many people drove in today or drive in from any part of the city. We should be looking for, unfortunately, low-cost, high-impact things right now. If anybody's driven into the city of Baltimore from the west side, coming in from I-70, anybody did that recently? Coming in from I-70, you hit 695. Anybody know what the sign says when you hit 695 and I-70? And I-70 is from San Francisco, right? You travel 3,000 miles, you come through St. Louis, and you come and you end at 70. It says south to Baltimore, north to New York. Street is a park and ride. It doesn't even say welcome to Baltimore, right? All of you in this room could probably put together kind of your coffer and put in $100. We could probably put a welcome Baltimore sign up there that actually welcomes people into the city. And if we look, kind of do an actual border study of how people are coming into the city, we are not a welcoming city. We don't even attempt to welcome people in. How are we going to re-oxygenate ourselves if we're not even welcoming people? So thinking about, from a neighborhood perspective, there's a huge kind of graduation happening today, that's why that's happening. So thinking about even from this is something that every single person in the city of Baltimore can actually be empowered to do. right? As a city, ideally, we'd be looking at our entryways and our gateways and make sure that there is some commonality there, that we're actually welcoming people in with just signs. That could be a first step. But every single one of us in the city of Baltimore has both the ability and possibly the responsibility to welcome people into their neighborhood. And this gets to kind of what the point of being an equitable city even is. This is what great cities should be about. That anybody of any race, any income, any background should be free and should feel free to work, live, play in any one of our neighborhoods. And this is literally not true. So if we think about what do we want with respect to equity, it's that any one of us could feel comfortable and safe in any one of our neighborhoods. And that actually is across, it's a universal statement, right? That if you are Black, you should be able to feel free to go in to live and work and play in any neighborhood. And if you're white, you should be able to live and work and play in every neighborhood. Or if you're Asian or Hispanic, that should be true. And if you think about the great cities of the world, this is true. Sorry. I thought I turned that off. So this is ideally what the goal of a Baltimore city should be, and thinking about how we can do that. This is a definition coming from Southern California, the conversation on racial equity, and I just want to read the part that I think is really important. Not only that anybody of any race could live, work, and play, but it's not just about helping people, but it's really also about helping the place. If we look at what happened in Downtown Winchester in kind of the great kind of the work in the 1990s, the CCI work, 600 people were trained, 300 people got jobs from that workforce training. None of the 300 people in that cohort live in Downtown Winchester today. Why? Because we didn't create a quality of life in Downtown Winchester that they would want to stay. There's an Annie Casey report of youth after the riots in 2015. They interviewed 50 youth in the neighborhood of Downtown Winchester and the surrounding neighborhoods, and they said, they had all kinds of thoughts about how they call it the setup city. This is a city that's setting us up to fail. They had all kinds of thoughts, but they had one thing in common. None of them wanted to live in the city of Baltimore when they grew up. Until we actually fix that and address that, I feel like we're all going to be frustrating not only ourselves but our own youth and not creating an equitable city. So key takeaways. In neighborhoods themselves, in the absence of kind of an awesome transportation system, in the absence of dealing with our 16,000 vacant and abandoned properties, what can people do right now? The question is, can you welcome people into your neighborhood? How do you want to do that? Who do you want to move in? Can you actually set the stage that people would want to move in? We have lots of neighborhoods right now that are doing simple things around marketing, right? Marketing their neighborhood, bringing people in, making it a welcoming atmosphere, doing the potluck, which costs $50, and actually bringing people together to get to know each other and want to stay and set that kind of social cohesion. Now, that can't be the only thing we do, but it does become something that everybody feels empowered that they can do, and that's kind of the message that we go out to neighborhoods to talk about, that if you care about all the other things that we care about, and if you're a declining neighborhood, none of those things will come naturally, and none of those things will come sustainably. And so how do we kind of make everything that we're doing be something that we can repopulate our neighborhoods in? I'm going to stop there. Any questions?